Part 8. Going into God's Place. God's special place was called Canaan, and God chose a man named Joshua to lead his people into the land. But there was a problem. Other people already lived in Canaan. They lived in cities like Jericho, with big, strong walls around them. The cities were filled with people who did not listen to God. God told Joshua, "Be strong and courageous." God told Joshua to have the people march around Jericho 6 days in a row. So the people marched and marched all day long. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 whole days they marched. Do you know what happened on the 7th day? When the trumpet sounded and the people shouted, God kept his promise, and the walls came tumbling down. God drove out their enemies. Then God's people lived in the land he had promised them. When Joshua was an old man, he reminded the people to obey God's word. "Choose this day who you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And the people said, "We also will serve the Lord." On that day, many of God's good promises to Israel were fulfilled. Israel promised to be God's people. Israel promised to obey God's word. If they kept their promise, they would always live in God's promised place. But after Joshua died, Israel disobeyed God's word, rejecting God from being king over them. So God punished Israel. He let their enemies rule over them. During this time, the Philistines ruled God's people. One of the Philistines was so big and strong that not one of God's people would fight him. Goliath was a giant. He stood over 9 feet tall. Goliath hated God's people, and the men of Israel were afraid of him, all except one. David was from a little town of Bethlehem. David believed in God's promise, that God's promise was big. David trusted God's word to be strong, so David decided to fight Goliath. He took his sling and a few stones and ran out to attack the giant. Do you know what happened next? God kept his promise to rescue his people. The first stone that flew from David's sling hit Goliath right between the eyes. David killed Goliath and rescued Israel from the Philistines. God was with David, and God gave David victory over his enemies in other battles. David, the mighty warrior, became king over God's people. David ruled over God's special place. Do you see David singing to God? He is thanking God for keeping his promise. Now that God's people were in God's place, it seemed that soon they would become a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. That's it for tonight.